Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me, as usual, is Angelo Giuliano. Hello, how are you, Angelo?
Good, good, Brian. It's been a while. It's been a while. I just want to say, hi to you. I hope you're doing well in Bangkok. Hi to everybody. Just wherever you come from, your nationality, your religion, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and so on, all fellow human beings. Glad to be together on Sunday, and let's try to share a special moment together, trying to share what is happening in the world. The world seems mad, but maybe it's not as mad. It's a transition. We mention this quite often. This transition between going from unipolar world to multipolar world, and I think the triggers are. I used to think that the trigger was Ukraine, but actually we need to look at. I think the symbol of Gaza, Palestine, Israel. It's actually so a very big symbol when we talk about the global South, and probably one of the last colony, symbol of a colonization imperialism, which is Palestine. So we see a lot of movements. So maybe I was thinking, maybe Brian, maybe we can go back to historical. How did we get to where we are right now? In with those strikes, Iranian strikes. Historically, I mean, why Iran? Did history start yesterday? I mean, today. Because people, it didn't start like this. So we need to go back maybe a little bit before. There was
As far as I know, I was just watching Fox News and CNN, and as far as I know, Iran just woke up, suddenly decided to launch a bunch of missiles at Israel for no reason at all. But as a matter of fact, Israel blew up an Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria. And the U.S. we constantly see articles like this. This is very important for people to understand. We constantly see the United States talking like this. This was right before the Iranian retaliation. People are calling it an Iranian attack, as if it came out of the blue. This was right before White House, very concerned about prospect of Israel-Iran war. And as you and I have been warning for years, Angelo, this was documented in the 2009 paper, Which Path to Persia, by the Brookings Institution. This wasn't these guys here listed here coming up with this plan. This was just them writing a paper reflecting the general consensus in Washington in regards to U.S. foreign policy toward Iran. They wrote in this paper all the way back in 2009 that Iran did not want war with the U.S. or Israel, and that they would have to provoke Iran into a war. So we have been warning about this for years and years and years, that when they killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani outside the airport in Baghdad, the U.S. did that. That was during the Trump administration. That was a provocation. They were trying to drag Iran into a war, did not want to fight. This attack on the embassy, the Iranian embassy in Damascus, this was an attempt to provoke Iran into a war. It does not want to fight. And we see this strike on Israel. I just want to point this out to people. Right here, Israel says Iran's missile and drone attack largely thwarted with very little damage. And if you read through the article, they admit that it was on military bases. They weren't striking embassies. They weren't striking civilian infrastructure. They weren't targeting shopping malls. It was a military base, a legitimate target, especially because they claimed the military bases they struck were involved in the attacks on the embassy in Damascus. So that it's very important to understand that. Let's go all the way back to October 7th, 2023, the Hamas attack on Israel, and then the resulting Israeli operation into Gaza. And people say that Israel is losing, they can't defeat Hamas, but I have a funny feeling that they don't want to defeat Hamas. They maneuvered Hamas into power in the first place, and they're using Hamas just like the U.S. uses Al-Qaeda and ISIS as a pretext, but also as a proxy. And we remember Hamas actually going to Syria and fighting Iranian forces, the Syrian Arab Army, Russian forces, alongside U.S., Turkey, Saudi, Qatari, even Israeli-backed militants. So that people have to peel apart these layers. And I understand it's very difficult. And you were talking about how unique this situation with Israel actually is. And I notice that people are most emotional about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whichever side they're on. This is the conflict they are most emotional about. And they are so emotional that you cannot actually point these things out. You could show them an article about Hamas siding with the US and Israel against Syria, and they just cast it aside as if it's irrelevant because they hate Israel so much. Anyone even superficially fighting Israel, they're going to root for them. And I understand that from the human nature point of view, but in terms of geopolitics analysis and sorting out what is really happening, we have to be much more careful about that. Of course, Israel should pay for what it's doing. We have to make sure we're not propping up one half of a two-part strategy the US and its proxies are using to destroy the region. So maybe you want to jump in there, Angela. I could obviously say a lot more about this.
All great points. I think it's you're absolutely right. We need to be very careful of not doing oversimplification. So I see people coming up with many different answers, but it's not, and very often white or black. And I think it's not like this. I would say, how would you see, this reaction? Do you have the impression that Iran had to do something, probably make a point, use that as a deterrent, I would say. A second thing would be maybe that it is also testing. It seems like what the Iran has been throwing was just, not the most advanced weapons in terms of drones, missiles, it's not the most high tech, but it was a way just to deterrent and also testing. And also, long term, just make a point. It was also, I think, part of it is face. Even though geopolitics is not about ego, but I think here was important just to make a point. And I have the impression here it was very interesting to see the position of the US that was not actually unconditionally backing Israel. And I have the impression that this was a calculated operation that would be at the advantage of both Iran and Israel. Just to give you an idea, what happens is that Iran had to react. So Iran, it's a matter of face. They needed to do something about this. And but Israel, if the reaction is too strong, then Israel, you escalate. And I have the impression that there's a kind of tacit agreement, at least I would say, between the US and Iran. And then they're trying to get Israel on board so there's not an escalation, because I think there's probably various factions with the Israeli government. You have the ones that are more hawkish, that are calling for the Dahia doctrines that we might actually touch later. What is your view on this? I have really the impression that this is actually a saving face exercise that we are experiencing now, that we might have two ways. One is actually, they made a point, and actually Israel is trying to present this as a victory because supposedly 99% of the drones and missiles were stopped by the Iron Dome, which I do not believe. I'm very skeptical about this figure. So presenting this as a win and saying, and somehow they don't go into an escalation, and both sides save face. That's my impression. But on the other side, I have, just right now, you have Ben Gvir coming up and saying, well, we are going to hit so much, so hard that it's, Iran, this will never happen ever. How hard do you want to do that? Is it like bluffing? What is next? I think that's the big question that everybody here wants to have. We don't have, we're just doing speculation here. Nobody has the answer. But I have the impression that it's going to be either ways. Either it stops and basically both countries have made a point, or there's an escalation, and then anything is possible.
Yeah, unfortunately, I would like to believe that, and I hope that is the case. And we've seen instances of that elsewhere. But unfortunately, again, if you read the 2009 Which Path to Persia paper, everything that they wrote in that paper has so far either been done, tried multiple times, already done, or in the process of being done. And one of the most extreme options that they had listed was using Israel to provoke a wider war the U.S. could then enter. The whole prerequisite required for this is that it does not look like the U.S. provoked this war. They want to make it look like they were trying to restrain Israel, and Israel just went and did it anyway. And then they can reluctantly wade into the war. This is what they spell out in the paper. And we've watched them setting this up since October 7th last year, creating this narrative, even though they admit there's no evidence at all that Iran was involved in October 7th. As others have pointed out, as we have pointed out, Hamas's primary sponsor is Qatar and other U.S. Persian Gulf allies. And it was Israel that knew this money was coming in, and they allowed it. They could have stopped it. They allowed it. They could have done many things to prevent the rise of Hamas, but they allowed it. And then the attack on October 7th proved to be the perfect pretext. They were waiting for something like this to happen so they could just level Gaza. I saw in the comments section, well, first of all, this one, I 100% agree with this. Yes, Iran is completely justified. Israel leveled an Iranian embassy is completely illegal against international law. There's no question about that. And again, if the U.S. was serious about restraining Israel, the least they could have done was condemn Israel in the UN Security Council, but they blocked condemnation. So what does that tell you there? Out of one side of their mouth, they're trying to claim that they're trying to de-escalate. Out of the other side of their mouth, they're doing everything possible to escalate. Then there's this one here. I don't buy Brian's take that Hamas is a proxy of Israel. Netanyahu is mostly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of IDF soldiers. Why is that hard to believe? Look at the U.S. They lied about WMDs in Iraq. They sent thousands of U.S. troops to their death based on an absolute lie to fight a completely unjustified war. And there's nothing different or special about the current Israeli administration. They are just as bad, if not worse. So yes, they would definitely send IDF soldiers to their death.
Yeah,
eagerly.
I think when they say, I mean, not a proxy, but Israel has facilitated the ascension of Hamas to power, and that's because they wanted an enemy which was which they could depict as being extremely radical. I just want to go back to what you said just before. So would you say that what the U.S. is doing with Israel is a bad cop, good cop, bad cop? Would it be a good definition? So basically, the U.S. is disassociated itself. So, but at the same time, is actually backing fully Israel, but it wants to look like the good cop, and actually even backing the Palestinian cause. But at the same time, it's just completely fake, because that's the game of good cop, bad cop. That's how actually you get someone to speak up. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but when you are a prisoner and they want to get information from you, they use a bad cop, which is going to beat you up, and then you have the bad cop, which is going to make friends with you, is going to give you cigarettes, and then somehow you're going to feel confident. And I had the impression that the U.S., and I think it's probably there are different reasons for that. I would say also it might be probably also related to, well, not only in terms of geopolitics to show that somehow they're not as radical as that, but at the same time internal consumption, because Biden needs to he's lost a lot of appeal internally, especially the leftist pro-Palestinians which used to vote Democrats and actually will probably switch to Trump. What is your opinion on that? So that's what you think when it comes to the U.S.? Because I was actually I started to have doubts. I really thought at some point Bibi Netanyahu was completely going. There were some tensions between Biden and Netanyahu, or was it just a show?
It's just a show. Look at this article from the Washington Post. U.S. approved more bombs to Israel on day of World Central Kitchen strikes. And this isn't the first time Israel massacred aid workers, UN staff, journalists. That's what they've been doing since they initiated their military campaign after October 7th. And so the U.S., again, They say they condemn this. They act, they wring their hands and they say this is terrible, and then they turn around and they give Israel more bombs. Absolutely everything Israel is doing in this conflict is enabled by the U.S. They could not do it without this. Yes, they have their own military, they have their own military industrial production, but it's nowhere on the level needed to fight any sort of large-scale conflict for any protracted period of time. So they're able to brutalize the Palestinian people on and off over the years, but to fight a large-scale conflict or a protracted conflict, they need the U.S. to send ordnance, shells, bombs, missiles, and that's what the U.S. has been doing this whole time. And so with all of their condemnation, again, it's just for public consumption. It's to create plausible deniability. The evidence is in the policy papers that they wrote years ago that they have been implementing ever since. They talk all about using Israel, creating plausible deniability, making it look like Iran brought this upon themselves, that it was not a conflict ultimately engineered by the U.S., provoked by their proxies in Israel, and then taken advantage of by the U.S. In terms of initiating large-scale conflict. And I want to show people the premeditated nature of this whole conflict. Do you remember right after October 7th? Let me see if I can find the article here. Yes, this one right here. This is Reuters. This was October 22nd, 2023. U.S. sending additional air defense systems to Middle East, Pentagon. And this was all about Israel going into Gaza, and people were saying, why does the U.S. need these air defense, missile defense systems sent to the Middle East? Surely not because of anything Hamas has. So why are they sending it? And if we go to the 2009 Which Path to Persia paper, and this was years and years ago, this is what it said, because they were talking about possible retaliation by Iran against provocations by either the U.S. or Israel. So it says, it seems far more likely that Iran might choose to respond in kind by lobbing ballistic missiles at U.S. bases, oil facilities, and other high-value targets located in the Gulf states, Israel, or other U.S. ally states. This contingency would merit deploying considerable anti-ballistic missile defense assets in the region and providing as much warning to U.S. allies as possible. So they were talking about the need to deploy these anti-missile systems ahead of any U.S. or Israeli provocation against Iran, because they were anticipating the retaliation, not some unprovoked attack by Iran, Iran's retaliation for these provocations targeting them. And then the Western media would spin the retaliation as an unprovoked attack. And then fast forward to 2023, that is exactly what they did. They started putting those anti-missile systems in place ahead of a provocation both the U.S. and Israel knew they were going to launch against Iran. And that is what we've watched unfold since. So, I mean, it seems very premeditated when you actually look at the policy paper, look at what the U.S. and Israel did from October 7th onward. It's very clear that they're working together. And just as you say, Angelo, the U.S. is trying to appear as reasonable, seeking de-escalation, diplomacy, and it's just, bumbling Joe Biden. He just can't get anything right. In reality, it's not supposed to go right. It's supposed to just continuously escalate towards war. That is the plan. That is what is written in the policy papers.
Brian, I just made a tweet actually the other day. It was about some defining moments that actually show clearly the decline of the collective West. And I would say you had Afghanistan, the humiliation. The U.S. spent how much did they spend? $2 trillion, right, in 20 years war. So they were defeated by the Taliban. The Taliban, we're not talking about the biggest army in the world. Then later on, you have the Houthis, Ansar Allah, which are standing up against, the biggest navy in the world, the UK and the US, and the US, they don't have any answer against Ansar Allah. Then you have NATO countries, $1.3 trillion of budget per year, they're actually being defeated in Ukraine against Russia. Then you have France, which is being kicked out of Africa. Now you have, the Hamas. Hamas is not, it's not a very sophisticated army, but they're doing an asymmetric war against the IDF, and they're winning. They it's winning in their own term. By the definition for Hamas of winning is not losing against Israel, is already winning. Because it's an asymmetric war, and they're doing, it's a fight for liberation. And now you have Iran standing up, and I think this is a defining moment, not only for this transition between from unipolar world to multipolar world, but also for Israel, because in the history of Israel, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but in 75 years, this is the first time that they are putting Israel in a very difficult position. Israel has won all its wars. Now you have a country like Iran, which is standing up against Israel. And this is the first time in Israel's history that they might not have any answer, and they don't have the means to escalate. Because if they do not escalate, what is going to happen if they, why don't we take two scenarios? What is going to happen if they don't escalate? And what is going to happen if they escalate? What do you think?
No, these are all good questions, and I even see some people in the comment section talking about this also. How's the U.S. or Israel going to wage full-scale war against Iran? And as you're pointing out, Angelo, they really cannot. Think about the Patriot missile shortage that they have regarding Ukraine right now, and I don't know who saw the videos of Israeli missile defense systems firing. It included Patriot missile systems just firing all of their Patriot missiles. So the U.S. is going to have to send missiles to both Ukraine and Israel, and there are none to spare. So that is the question, isn't it? And what we're looking at is desperation. The whole U.S. plan in Ukraine, that was desperation. If you remember, right before the U.S. overthrew the elected government in Ukraine in 2014 and started militarizing Ukraine, what was happening in Europe? They were working more and more closely with Russia. Germany was building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. There were already other pipelines operating. They were getting all of this cheap energy from Russia. They were also starting to work closer together with China. People might not even remember that, but for a short period of time, there was a lot of talk there. And then what did the U.S. do? They used war to reassert themselves. They forced a wedge deep between Europe and Russia, and also China. If people now notice that they've lumped China in with Russia as part of this proxy war taking place in Ukraine. Now they're trying to do the exact same thing in the Middle East. Right before this all started with October 7th, what was going on in the Middle East? We saw Iran and Saudi Arabia repairing their ties. We saw Syria welcomed back by the Arab nations after years and years of being excluded. And as these nations were working with the U.S. against Syria, and even Syria and Turkey began talking, even though there's still Turkish troops inside Syria. So the region began shifting in a direction that did not suit the U.S., and time is on the side of the region against U.S. hegemony, against the few remaining allies the U.S. has in the region. And so what are they going to do to try to reassert themselves there? They have no answer to, say, Russia or China's constructive cooperation with these countries. Their only card is war. So they're trying to start a war and, at a minimum, burn the region down. We have to look at this globally. It's not just Ukraine. It's not just the Middle East. It's also China. Ultimately, that is America's number one threat. They're imagining that it's a threat. The prospect of China surpassing the West is unacceptable to them, and they need to stop it. So just imagine even if the U.S. and Israel cannot win any sort of war in the Middle East, but they can just burn the region to the ground, disrupt everything. How is that going to affect China ultimately? It's either going to reduce or cut off their hydrocarbons. I think that would be a serious blow to China. Yes, they're hedging against that with direct pipelines with Russia, but that will take time to put into place, and they can't replace all of that capacity. So that, if you look at it on a global scale, you can see it's desperation. It's the U.S. rushing, and they're not necessarily interested in winning a war against Iran. Causing chaos may be just good enough. So I think that's one part of it. The other part is Israel is a proxy of the U.S. Israel is just as disposable to the U.S. ultimately as Ukraine is. Israel has nuclear weapons. And you can see how this narrative is being created around Israel that, oh, they're bad guys. They just do whatever they want. They don't listen. They don't listen to Washington. Washington's always telling them, don't kill aid workers, don't bomb embassies. And they just do it anyway. And that they just use nuclear weapons. We had no control over it. There's nothing we can do about it. And just think about Israel launching nuclear weapons at Iran's nuclear sites, military industrial sites, civilian infrastructure. How much damage is that going to actually do to Iran? I think it would be quite significant. I don't think it would be something that Iran would be able to immediately recover from. So these are all things that I fear, and certain things that I think we could already see taking shape.
What do you see the position of China and Russia? I have the impression that usually they have a policy of, at least China, of non-intervention, but I have the impression that China would be more involved when it comes to Iran, because it's a matter of national security. China is highly dependent on the region, and also we need to be really careful, because what happens, it's not only the supply of Iran oil and gas, but it's also the whole region, because there's a blockade. There could be a blockade done by Iran of closing the Strait of Hormuz, and I think Hormuz is probably 30 to 40% of the oil supply in the world, and that would damage, I would say, most of the world except the U.S., because the U.S. is self-sufficient. But Europe would be very damaged by this. So what would be the position? I would think that Russia would be much more involved than China, but China would be quite upset, and I don't know. I have the impression that actually China would at least help financially, and if there is more sanctions, even though we are at the maximum when it comes to Iran, but they will help out in whatever way it can.
I think China is well aware that all of this is ultimately aimed at them. They are trying to stick to their principles of non-interference, but we do see them, just like you say, there's other ways that they can help. And look at how they're helping Russia circumvent Western sanctions, for example, and as an outlet for Russian energy, because if Europe doesn't want it, they'll gladly buy it, and they have been, and that has helped Russia's economy tremendously. But think about the U.S. creating chaos in the Middle East, cutting hydrocarbons flowing to China. Think about how the U.S. is positioning its military all across Asia Pacific. Also, they're admitting it that these forces are designed to interdict shipping lanes, ships, maritime shipping. That's the whole point of this. All of their policy papers talk about cutting off Chinese maritime shipping. And as we've talked about many times over the years, China's Belt and Road Initiative is basically an attempt to circumvent these long-standing plans the U.S. has to cut China off from oil in the Middle East, commerce all around the globe. This is something that China has faced and understands is a threat for many years now. Eventually, China is going to have to react, just like Russia, because Ukraine was also a trap for Russia, and Russia jumped into the trap, but they were prepared for it. Iran is jumping into the trap right now. Maybe they feel like they're prepared for it. Eventually, China does have traps being set up for it, especially in regards to its island province of Taiwan. Eventually, they're going to have to do something about it, because the U.S. is going to continue putting pressure on China, leaving them no option but to react. Despite all of their patience, eventually they're going to have to do something. But it's just a matter of what, when, and where. I always suspected it'll be much closer to China's shores. I don't think they have the capability, the military capability to project power to, say, the Middle East. But maybe economic aid would be just as useful for, say, Iran.
So now we have three poles of tensions. So Ukraine, there's the Middle East, and there's also this long-term project. I mean, I would call it more like a medium-term project. This pivot to Asia to actually contain China and to create chaos in the region. So the problem is that where are we going with Ukraine? We see Ukraine, the front might be collapsing. There's a high probability of collapse of the front. You might be able to tell us more about this. Then you have the Middle East. I mean, how much? I mean, it's the US is overextended, even though they have already troops in the Far East, in the South China Sea. There are probably more than 100,000 troops between Korea and Japan. But I have the impression they overextended, their forces and money-wise. I mean, how much they can fund. The economy is really bad in the US. There's $1 trillion of interest for debt of $34 trillion. It's not sustainable. The dollar is actually, we are in the process of de-dollarization. So as long as they have the global currency, they can still print money, but there is an impact in terms of inflation. So I feel it's overextended. How many fronts can the US fight in? I have the impression that only one front. They have to choose, but ultimately, what happens is that if they're not going after China, it's over. They still need to go after China, and I have the impression that they will do whatever they can just to have those three fronts. And of course, the idea is to have proxies. So they'll fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, to the last European. Then they will fight Iran to the last Israelis, because they don't care about Israelis. People are completely wrong. Let me repeat this. They're completely wrong. They do think that actually Israel controls the US. Wrong. You see, actually, Ukraine, what they want to do in Ukraine, and they're very open about this, they want to create a new Israel in Ukraine. But it's not about because they care about Ukrainians. The same as Israelis. The single function of Israel all over since the British Empire wants to create an entity to divide the Levant and the Maghreb, this whole Arab world, to divide it. The Muslim world, and they succeeded. Actually, yes. I don't know if you followed a little bit on Twitter. I don't know if it's hilarious or it's sad. I don't know if I want to cry or laugh, but you have, people are going after Iran, saying Iran is not doing enough, and they're competing between the Shia, the Sunni, the Arabs, the Persians, and it's hilarious. It's about who is actually on the forefront of this axis of resistance. And when I see that, I want to tell them, you are, because they are. This is the pro-Palestinian camp. You are playing the hand of this divided and control. You're still there. The world is changing, and they have the village attitude. It's like, the village attitude. It's like, oh, our village is nicer than your village, and they fight each other. And the funny thing is that the more similar they are, the more they focus on the small differences. You see what I mean? And it's very sad. It's especially the Arab world, the Muslim world has been divided, and they need to get together. And what I see is that China is bringing on the table a philosophy which is much more pragmatic, which is actually seeking, but it's deeply inside the Chinese culture, because Chinese, they don't believe in white and black. It's about how you find this mix of harmony. If we can, but set aside the differences. If we have differences, well, let's say we don't need to be together, but we don't need to fight. It's not because we are not together that we have to fight. So look for what unites us and set aside the differences. And I think this is the philosophy of this multipolar world. Actually, this whole idea, we talk about geopolitics, but we should touch the philosophy, because it's deep inside. It's very culture. Why the West is so much about imposing upon the world an ideology, because it's very, very much ideology driven. It's not very tangible. If it's tangible, it's about class struggle. It's about how you can produce stuff, how you can make lives better. When it's about ideology, it's very dangerous. Because ideology, it just divides people. It divides people on small things. So this new ideology of this new idea of multipolar world is really how we can coexist together, while the West has been thriving on chaos, on dividing the global South. You see, and that is really interesting. We need to touch more this philosophy which is behind this. And you see, the US, the only way the US can still be the hegemon, the global hegemon, it's about how you can create chaos and divide countries. So here, Ukraine, what happened with Ukraine? With Ukraine, it was a big blow for Europe. Europe was living on cheap gas from Russia, and they were very scared about this union between Russia, Eurasia. Eurasia is the most dangerous entity. It's a big mass, and there's so many people in this bloc. And the US is actually so far that actually is going to be isolated. You see, being far is an advantage because you cannot be attacked. But when it's about a bloc, economic bloc, you are far from where everything is happening. It's Eurasia. So you contain Europe, you separate it from Russia. Then you have the Middle East, what they've been doing for 75 years. The Middle East was, there was this whole Arab world. They have a single language, and culturally they're very similar. They all can speak the same language. That's already something uniting. Then there is religion, it unites people. And then there is this oil and gas. It's extremely rich. Israel's functions was to divide, and they've been very successful. Just think about this. Iran, Iraq. They make Iran and Iraq. They funded both sides. How many wars we had? Afghanistan. I mean, it never stopped. And who was always behind that was Israel, the Mossad. You had the CIA behind the Taliban and so on. And they're doing the same in the South China Sea. But it's always proxy. And they're very open about this. They say, we are going to it's going to be good for US economy, and we don't have to spill blood because they're nowhere. Actually, the closest, when it comes to war, it's they control everything remotely. They might, the biggest risk they might take is actually by coaching people in the trenches, but it's not going to be at the trench. So that's the whole idea, and I think it's important just to remind people that this is, it's not good for the world, but it's not good for Americans too, because ultimately Americans are the first victims of their own government. It's not, they don't benefit from that. When I hear Americans that are part of the masses, the 99%, I want to ask them, how do you benefit from that? You do not benefit from that. You need to actually empower yourself and get power, because you are already oppressed, and you are actually cheering your government because you feel part of this US empire project. Guess what? You are the first victim. So in reality, when we are talking about geopolitics, it's mainly the 99%. We need to keep in mind, we can think in terms of countries, but we have to ultimately it's the 99% against the 1% globalist elites that in order to keep power, they need to keep dividing the world and create chaos. And they going through those cycles, but ultimately it's about global control of the 1%. When I say 1%, it's probably 0.001%. It's a few thousand, globalist families and multinational corporations. Sorry, that was a long one, Brian.
No, it's important. I mean, this is kind of the thing that we're always trying to do. We're trying to cut through the ideology because the ideology blinds people. Ideology and emotions, and this whole thing with Iran, with Gaza, Israel is doing this on purpose. This is what they have written in their plans. We're going to provoke them. This is the art of war 101, using your enemy's emotions against them, blinding them to reason, and causing them to make deadly mistakes. That is the whole point here. That's what they are trying to do. And this is why Iran and also Russia and also China have ignored one provocation after the other. It was only until Russia was fully prepared to jump into the trap, spring it, and have it blow up in the face of the people who said it, that they finally went into Ukraine. Remember, that had been ongoing since 2014 and actually much earlier before that. I just saw someone in the comments, it's already scrolled up. They were saying something about, Brian, why do you keep talking about Which Path to Persia from 2009? Aren't there any more modern papers you can point to? It's not convincing. If you read it, it's verbatim, word for word. What they wrote in that paper in 2009 is unfolding right now. I've told people over, and sometimes I feel like I'm a broken record, but I know people aren't reading it and they're not listening because they want to look at their ideological side that they've picked, and they want to cheer it on, and they don't want inconvenient things like facts and documented conspiracies to get in the way of that. They want to cheer on Hamas. I've heard people say, I don't care if Hamas is ultimately maneuvered into power by Israel, funded by Qatar, and it's just another one of these groups that are being used to manipulate people. You were just talking about people being manipulated. I don't care. I just want to see Israelis pay for what they're doing. But this kind of toxic cycle of violence is designed, it's called the strategy of tension. It's designed to suck everyone in, no matter which side you pick, and eat you up.
You mentioned 2009. Actually, it's a very recent paper. In reality, we mentioned this before. The Pentagon Papers, if you read the Pentagon Papers, they are very clear about the ultimate goal is to go after China.
Yes, all the way back in the 60s and 70s.
So
yeah.
People, what they don't realize that, of course, we have the impression, especially because the Western world is built on election cycles, so it can be very emotional, and sometimes it seems like they don't make sense. But in reality, the policies of those think tank papers, they are very clear, and those actually don't change much. They it's about global hegemony, and they were very clear. Actually, there was those two poles when we are talking about Ukraine, it was a plan which actually it goes back to the USSR. Actually, the Gladio operation. If you really want to go back a long time, what is happening with Russia, it's an unfinished war against the USSR. It's a continuation of the Cold War. That's how I see it, because when you look at Bandera, the Bandera actually were financed during the USSR days, was not during Russia's days. So you had Gladio operation, and it never really stopped. So ultimately, what people forget is that what they wished for Russia was actually, at some point, they even though Russians were allied, the USSR was allied to the Allies, to the UK and the US, but they actually were tempted to go after winning against the Nazis and Hitler. They wanted to go after the USSR because they thought that USSR was very weakened, and we can actually give the final blow to the USSR. You see how sick they are.
Yeah. So a lot of people don't understand that World War II was not good guys versus bad guys. It was about one aspiring empire fighting the established empires, both in Europe, between the Nazis and the British, were one of the most abusive empires in history up until that point, and between the United States and Japan in Asia Pacific. People always say, oh, Japan struck us at Pearl Harbor, so we had to retaliate. The US was already fighting Japan inside Asia Pacific long before Pearl Harbor. That's why Japan, again, imagine history 20 years from now, they'll be like, you remember that time Iran just out of the blue shot a bunch of missiles at Israel? And then we had World War III and how bad Iran is. I mean, that is what they did. It's not to defend the Japanese, but it's just to say it's not black and white. There was a lot of gray in there. I would say that the Japanese Empire and the Americans were both fighting over territory that belonged to neither of them, and neither one of them were right. All the U.S. proved in that war was that it was more brutal, more ruthless, and more depraved ultimately than the Japanese Empire. The 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan when it was already defeated. They didn't have a single capital ship floating in the ocean, and they dropped those 2 bombs anyway. As you were saying, because the Soviet Union wasn't that, oh, we're worried the Soviet Union is a threat to us. They wanted global control, domination, and so the Soviet Union was an obstacle, just like Russia and China are today. Sorry, I didn't mean to butt in, but
Yeah, yeah. No, but
just want to
it's
make that,
really
that
important
point.
to go back to history. When sometimes they might actually, they try to finance both sides. They start with one side and then they shift to the other side. I mean, when we are talking about the Nazis actually, they were financed by Wall Street. Hitler was financed by Wall Street because the danger back then was the red. There was the Bolshevik, was the communist in Germany. So they started propping up Hitler, and there was actually a huge transfer of technologies because, especially after World War One, Germany was extremely weak. So how did Germany go to the Hitler's time with a very modern army and so on? Was because the transfer of technologies and also the backing of Wall Street, because they were afraid that Germany would turn red. And it's the same as actually Japan. Japan somehow, there was this transfer of technologies in Japan too. How Japan became so strong because there was this Meiji Revolution, and they were backed by the Western world, the bankers, and that's how Japan actually got so strong. But then it got too dangerous. You see, the problem is that once they use you and they become you become their allies, but if you can become too strong, then they turn against you. And that's what they're doing with Germany and Europe, right? Same. What did they do with the allies in Europe? And which, by the way, the EU was a CIA project. It's really important for people to understand that Jean Monnet, the father of the EU, was on the CIA payroll. There's lots of evidence about this. So the EU was a US project after World War II. And what they did was really the ultimate goal was to control the EU and dissolve the nation state. So what we're seeing now is actually they're attacking the EU. I mean, when we look at Nord Stream 2, this infrastructure is partly owned by the EU, and it's destroying EU economies. So you see, they start backing, you become the allies, but then if the EU becomes too strong and they see that EU is too close to Russia, what you do? You actually contain the EU and you create chaos. And ultimately, the best success that the US could have would be to have all Europe fighting Russia, and you have mutual destruction. And what the US does, it's giving weapons and actually lending money. You see, these lend-lease agreements, they did it with the Ukraine, but they did it in World War II the same. The US was not involved into World War II. I'm talking about physically. US came into the war at the end when the war was almost over, and they lost very little soldiers. They lost especially against the Japanese, but then they dropped 2 bombs when the war was almost over. But ultimately, what they did was sell weapons and a lend-lease agreement. That's what they did. They're trying to do the same. They did the same with Ukraine. Keep in mind that they say we send aid to Ukraine. It's not aid. It's loans, and ultimately those are debt trapped, and they're turning those debt trapped in favor of BlackRock and those institutions that are actually taking the assets of Ukraine against those debts. It's the same. They're trying to put in place in Taiwan the same system. I don't know if you've seen, but they have drafted document. It's just draft, but they're trying to work on a system with Taiwan on lend-lease. So basically, they already laying the ground for Taiwan. We are going to do the same. You see, how many times do they have to do it? So this is why
Or people wake up.
They need to learn history. If you don't learn history, you are doomed to do exactly the same mistake. And you see, it worked really well in World War II. The US, when you look at the share of GDP of the US, is skyrocketed. It went to 40 to 50% of the world's economy. Do you know why? Because the world was completely destroyed, and there was only one economy which was untouched, was the US. They were producing all along, and they were lending money. Not only, it was not like giving, it was lending money. The USSR gave back the rest of the money only, a decade ago, not long ago, and Ukraine, they'll never be able to do that. They'll have to give all the assets, land, and so on. and they are going to be in debt forever. So that's what they're doing, and it's sickening because they do not care. They pretend that we care about Ukraine. Let's put a flag, blue and yellow flags. Let's pretend we are for Israelis. They're not even for Israelis. They're not. They're not. They make them believe. They even make them believe that Israel is controlling the US. It's not. Israel is a tool, and actually, the Jews, the religion, the Judaic religions have been hijacked. Those are the first victims. I know we're extending ourselves too, but the Zionist project was actually a very anti-Semite project in the sense that many people, Jews that were in the concentration camps, they could have gone to the US, but the US, the Zionists, they didn't want that. They didn't want that because they wanted those people to go to Palestine. So hundreds of thousands of Jews, they died in concentration camps because the Zionists didn't want them to go in other places than Palestine. Can you imagine how sick they are? So the first anti-Semites are actually the Zionists. And people forget, there was a Havana agreement between Hitler and the Zionists in 1933. It was very clear. Already then, the biggest friends of the Zionists was Hitler. But, it's just unconventional, but people need to do their homework. It's all out there, really. It's just about spend more time, just question. And I would say people need to avoid oversimplification. But those simplification makes people feel safer, because I think it's very much like Western mentality. It's like when people watch a movie, those Western movies, it's always who's the good guy, who's the bad guys. And when you are in Asia, you have more like nuance. It's more subtle because it's like people. I'm not a good guy, but I'm not a bad guy. I have my nuances, like everyone, And geopolitics is like this too. It's about interest, national interest. And this is why when we look at the whole region in the Middle East, we need to be really careful. We say, oh, Egypt is a US puppet. Well, no. Well, maybe not. Even US allies very often are not even allies. They're just hostages. What can you do? You do what you can. But I would say, I think we need to point out sovereignty, at least sovereignty. That's the main point that we need to do is it a sovereign state? Because ultimately, when they become really a sovereign state, they can actually define their own destiny. And I think this is the key thing. Every time what we need to point out is sovereignty. Countries need to be sovereign states. It's about empowering yourself and define your own destiny. But what you need to do, it's about controlling your information space, national security laws. You need to control your borders. You need to control your currencies. And you need to kick out all foreign interference, all those NGOs, and that's our main work. I think I would say, Brian, that's what we focus 50% of the time, right? It's about sovereignty, really. People, and what I'm surprised is that many people they do not understand what is that concept. It's that concept of sovereignty. People think it's it's a vague word. It's about nationalistic and so on. No, it's about defining your own destiny. And ultimately, what we're doing, it's we're going backward. From going into the multipolar, the unipolar world, which has actually it's about hijacking sovereignty and hijacking democracies too, to going back to foundation, how every people can define their own destiny, and ultimately how are they going to work together. And that's the multipolar world.
Yeah. And that is a point that we're always trying to get across, for people to look at what's actually going on and not to let ideology blind them. A lot of people do analysis by ideology, which is always going to lead you off a cliff. People will look at Thailand and they will say, well, I'm a Westerner. I don't like monarchies. Thailand's a monarchy, so the protesters must be the good guys. And you have to look at who is actually funding the protesters and what their agenda actually is. And if it's being funded by the United States and it's to transform Thailand into a battering ram against China, then no, it's not in Thailand's best interests. It's undermining, usurping Thai sovereignty. countries don't have to look like your country. They don't have to act and do what you do to be good or acceptable. Every country has their own approach. And like you say, Angelo, if they are truly a sovereign country, that's all that matters. That's their decision. They get to decide who they are and how they want to manage their own affairs. And you look at any conflict around the world, especially one that the U.S. is behind, which is many of them. Myanmar, for example, people will say, I don't like a military-led government. Superficially, it seems really bad. Like, why would you need a military government? But then, like you say, look at the history. Look at who's behind the militants fighting the central government. And that's not to defend the central government, but it's to say what is really going on versus these narratives that you hear on the TV. And worst of all, if the same people who told you Iraq had WMDs is now telling you Iran is picking a fight with Israel, or Russia's the bad guy going into Ukraine, you should stop and give pause for thought. That didn't these people lie to us about WMDs? Didn't they lie to us about freedom fighters in Libya and Syria? Is it possible that this is the first time they're telling the truth ever? And the chances are pretty slim. And then go to China, because a lot of people will agree with our analysis on, say, Russia. But then they'll disagree with us on the Middle East because they're ideologically invested in one side or the other. And then because they, deep in their heart, they have an affinity for Western supremacy, they hate China. They do not want to see a non-white nation rise to the top of, the largest, most powerful country in the world being non-white. This is in their mind, whether they want to admit it openly or not. This is unacceptable to them. And so they're willing to believe anything anyone says negative about China, even if it's the same people they know are lying to them about, say, Russia and Ukraine. That's crazy. That's crazy. This is one of the things we're trying to wake people up to. Someone said Islamophobia too it's a leftover from the so-called war on terror, which we all know was a scam. It was a complete scam. The terrorists were being backed by the U.S. themselves. That's why I tell people to be careful about these armed groups in the Middle East. A lot of them are run by the West through their proxies, through intermediaries. You have to be really careful about that. And they were killing. It was mostly actual Muslims fighting and defeating them all across the region. Look at the Syrian Arab army is mostly Sunni, led by Alawites. And they were all fighting shoulder to shoulder against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, all being backed by the U.S. and its proxies. So when you actually follow the money, which we always tell people to do, follow the money, read the policy papers. Okay, it's from 2009, but if every single thing in its pages are being executed verbatim up until 2024, then it's time to take a look at that and kind of move away from your ideological narratives that you've accepted, that you're invested in. You have to challenge yourself. You have to follow the truth no matter where it brings you. That's something that we try to do all the time. And yes, the truth will bring you to uncomfortable places, but you just have to go there. You have to look at it. And after a while, you have no ideology because you realize that ideologies are mostly things being used to manipulate people. Your ideology should just be following the truth wherever it takes you. That is the safest bet, and it's the most honest way to move through life. And it's also the best chance you have at understanding what's going on. And one last thing, think about how dangerous ignorance is. Think about the people in Ukraine who bought into U.S. propaganda about Russia and who are either dying or they're sending their kids off to die for no reason except to prop up U.S. hegemony for another couple of years. Think about that. Think about the people in, say, Taiwan or the Philippines going along with these client regimes the U.S. has put into power, driving their countries into the ground. Think about how dangerous and sometimes literally deadly ignorance can be. So this is why the truth is important. It's not just morally correct. It could literally save your life to know the truth about what's going on in the world around you. You have anything else? I think I starred 2 or 3 questions. I didn't look at them yet, but you have anything else you want to? We're at about an hour. We could go a little bit over, but
Yes, we
Go
can
ahead,
give.
Dan.
Maybe we can take a few questions, but I think it's important. The problems that we have when we judging a country, I mean, just judging itself is actually wrong by itself. But when we're trying to see objectively a country, we have a problem with lenses. So I see sometimes. For example, Chinese trying to justify, well, China, it's like this, it's but they don't. You shouldn't justify it. China doesn't need to be good to the West. China needs to be good to Chinese. Afghanistan needs to be not good to us, but good to Afghani. So I do not care. I do not care. If they have their rights, they have their values. It's not me to judge. They'll go with their own pace and they'll decide for what is best for them. The problem we have is that once you start judging and we want to shape other people at our own image, and that is wrong. That is wrong. If we do respect them, we do not meddle into their countries, and that's the world that this multipolar wants to do. It's a live and let live, live and let live. And you have to think in terms of neighbor, right? Imagine you live here in this apartment, but your neighbor next door, when you have infringement of your sovereignty, it means that you are accepting. I'm going to be extreme, but you accept someone that comes into your house, is going to sleep into your own bed with your wife, is going to tell your kids, is going to teach your kids his values, and he's going to tell you what you eat, how to breathe, and actually is going to control your wallet. You see, when you have the US dollar and you actually trying to impose things upon other countries, it's the same. It's like someone going to your own apartment, your own house, and is going to control your money. It's going to tell you, well, I'm going to lend you at this percentage, and if you don't pay, then I'm going to take your furnitures and so on. You want to buy oil, you have to use my currency. So that's the idea of sovereignty. And so ultimately this multipolar world is going to be about, guess what, I'm not going to my neighbors, let's having him to solve, to make his house peaceful, stable, prosperous. And then in my house, well, if I want to do a party with my neighbor and we find common ground, then we can do something together, but we don't need to sleep together, right? We don't need to sleep together. We don't, and we don't need to influence each other. We don't need to impose our values upon each other. If we are well together, let's work together. And that's the idea of multipolar world. And that's the problem we have with this US hegemony. It's about imposing, controlling, and so on. But it's not only controlling the rest of the world, it's controlling their own population, because ultimately it's those globalist elites. And I want to point out, it's really important just to also teach people, it's not only geopolitics in terms of countries, but it's this World Economic Forum agenda, Bilderberg Group, those globalist elites that are taking over. Because ultimately what they want to build is destroy nation states, deconstruct human being, everything, destroying what makes us united. What makes us united is it's everything which is related to identity, religion, nation, loving your country, family, all those values. That's what makes you, once you take away this, you become completely isolated. You don't work together anymore. So it's a societal. I don't like to go too much into that, but it's part of their strategy. It's about completely deconstruction of nation state, also at the individual level. And they are very open about this. What they say is that you will own nothing and you'll be happy. But ultimately, the CBDC, central digital banking currency, they'll go into that too. Ultimately, what they'll do is that they'll tap into your wallet. They'll find excuses. It's going to be COVID, it's going to be the ecological transition, and they tap into your wealth. They say, well, guess what? We'll take 10% of your wealth. And ultimately, you will really own nothing. That's what they want to do. So if you, even those, I want to scare off even those ones, they identify themselves to this Western empire. Well, you know what? I think all the world, the masses, the 99% have the same enemies. And you see, we can get them to unite us, because ultimately it's a class struggle. It's the 99%. They are under control, and they're dividing us at the national level and in geopolitics as well.
Yeah, and this was something that they've worked on for a long time in many different ways, and many different circles of interest have pursued this type of agenda. And I don't think that it's working, and I don't think it's sustainable. I think they're out of time. I think that's why they're rushing and becoming so desperate. Like I said, it's a 2009 paper that we keep referring to regarding Iran, and they're still reading from it. I've seen people in the comment section saying, well, things are different now. Of course it's different now, but it's still the same plan. And they've tried to adapt it to what is going on, but ultimately, global empire, it's unsustainable. You cannot sustain it. Tiny percentage of the population cannot control the entire world, and you can see how the U.S. is going about doing this by dividing and destroying everyone. Just as you're saying, Angelo, that's the only way a tiny percentage can control the majority of the planet, is by dividing and destroying everyone, and by people sticking together and seeing through all of this nonsense, refusing to be divided, refusing to fall for all of these different narratives. They can, and they are being defeated, I guess you could put it that way. We'll just go through these questions. Now that war in the Middle East is at a greater risk, what will happen to U.S. occupation of East Syria? I mean, those troops are sitting out there. They're very vulnerable, and I think they would be a target if things continue to escalate. I think they already have been targeted, and it's a very small number of troops, and maybe they're keeping them there as a tripwire. A tripwire is you keep a number of your troops in a country so that if they're attacked, you can use it as justification for a wider war. But as people have pointed out, the U.S., do they have the ability to launch a full-scale war against Iran? I just don't think that they do. But what I think they would want to do is make a case for Israel to use its nukes. The U.S. can pretend they were against it, and they can just wreck the whole region. That's what they're trying to do right now. They can't control it. They have no way of competing against, say, Russia or China in terms of economics and development. What they can excel at, and what they do excel at, is dividing and destroying. They're wrecking Europe, their own supposed allies, and they're trying to do the same thing to the Middle East. To also try, I'm seeing them do it here every single day in Asia. Let's see, where's another one? If they close the Strait of Hormuz, wouldn't Russia profit, considering they are also exporting oil and gas? Price of these commodities would rise. You want to take that one, Angelo?
Well, in some
way, if you look at the Red Sea,
I don't see Russia. Of course, there would be like increasing prices of oil and gas. I think probably Russia in some ways would benefit from that, but it's not the long-term plan of Russia is to build this multipolar world. It's about BRICS. It would not be in the interest of Russia, I would say, but that's what the US would want, because that would create chaos. But I would say the problem but it would create also problems for the US because of inflation. That would have ripple effect into the US and the partners of the US. I think it's not the Strait of Hormuz being closed. That would be just a bit too much. But if it can just contain the whole region, that would be an objective. That would fulfill an objective. It's not about the gaining ground and so on. It's a game of regime change. How you can do regime change, and if you can't, just create chaos. Because by creating chaos, relatively, you contain, and there's going to be a decrease in GDP in those economies. But ultimately, the way that the US is thinking is about relatively how better I'm going to compare to them. So you see, the multipolar world is how we can make this cake bigger, and we are somehow going to divide in kind of equal shares. So it's about this global prosperity. For the US, it's okay to make the cake smaller, but I want 90% of the cake. It's not about while you could just focusing on making this cake bigger. But I just want to point out, we didn't touch this with Israel, but there is a risk. There's a risk of actually nuclear. The use of nuclear bombs. If it becomes existential, this is why Israel will never be defeated completely defeated. Maybe it would implode, civil war. I don't know. It's a speculation. But I would say we need to be really careful, because when it becomes existential for Israel, we know how crazy they are. Well, they kill how many, they have no problem to kill hundred thousands of Palestinians. They have no problem. No problem. They want to displace them, but they are, they want to displace 2 million of Palestinians to the Sinai in Egypt, right? So they do not care. So they wouldn't hesitate if they had the backing. They wouldn't hesitate to drop a nuclear bomb. So this is, and I think Iran, they know that. And the question is, how far is Iran to getting the nuclear capacity? I don't know. They might have. I don't know. But that would be a good thing, maybe. I think if the Iran has the nuclear capacity. What do you think about this, Brian?
It's a good question. So is this: why can't Russia give Iran a nuclear umbrella? I think that's also a good question. That's something we have to look into. There's a lot of implications to extending your nuclear umbrella over another country. But I agree with you. And Angela, you've said many times that of all the nations with nuclear weapons, Israel is probably the most likely to use them. And you're talking about how unhesitant they are to kill Palestinians. Look at what the current Israeli administration is doing to Israel itself, the way it has brainwashed its own population. Just imagine how much further along Israel would be if they coexisted with their neighbors, they had a two-state solution with Palestine, and they actually worked to cooperate with everyone in the region rather than as a junkyard dog for Washington and Wall Street. Imagine how much further along they would be. And yet this is where they are. And if you see some of these Israeli people, and it's not everyone in Israel, that's why people have to be careful. Not everyone in Israel agrees with what the current government or military is doing. They're actually extremely against what it is. They work hard against it. It's just as hard for them to work against their own government as it is for Americans to try to work against the deep state that exists in Washington and Wall Street. But look at what they're doing to their own people. And look at where they're leading Israel. It is a dead end, and they're out of time. That's why they're panicking. That's why they leveled an Iranian embassy in Damascus. It's because they're out of time. They need to provoke this and get it. That's why I'm worried about the use of nuclear weapons, because the U.S. is watching a window of opportunity close. I don't think Israel is going to be defeated and destroyed. I don't think it's going to collapse into civil war. I think what will happen is these corrupt puppets in Israel, they will be out, and a new circle of interests that want to work with the rest of the world, they will come in and they will rejoin humanity. And the window of opportunity for the U.S. to use Israel in this manner will close for good. And that includes using nuclear weapons by proxy against a country like Iran, for example. It's a huge mess. And this is why I worry, because they're out of time. The U.S. is out of time, and they're not thinking clearly. They wanted to get this done many years ago. And when you read these papers, when you remember General Wesley Clark talking about 7 countries in 7 years or something, how long ago was that? And how far along have they gotten with that? A little bit, but then they kind of stalled in Syria. They haven't made much progress since. So this is what I'm worried. I'm worried that they're going to panic and do something regrettable. What do you think about Americans abusing technology, monopolizing hardware, software, but they just care about profit? We talk about this all the time. Purpose-driven versus profit-driven. The purpose-driven Russian military industrial base versus the American profit-driven military industrial base, and it's like night and day. And a profit-driven anything is not going to be able to compete against purpose-driven, because the blind pursuit of profit, again, it leads you to an unsustainable dead end eventually. Angela, go ahead.
Just a good example of this profit purpose-driven difference. Do you know what is the biggest assets of the U.S. government? Is the student debt. Did you know that? Student debt is the biggest asset. So basically, because, You see, you have to pay. You in the US, you have to pay, and it's extremely expensive. But it's a huge business. The same as the healthcare. It's the same as the defense industry. So when you graduate from university, you have hundred thousands of dollars of debt, and that's actually U.S. debt is what you need to give to the government. So you see, so you have the healthcare industry is the same. The healthcare in the GDP of the US is 18%. When it goes to China, it's 6%. But China, with 6% of its GDP in healthcare, delivers more than the US because the US is profit driven. It's a special interest that are pocketing this. And we saw this in the defense industry the same. And the problems when you have this, actually, you're losing completely the purpose of society. It's a duality, purpose versus profits. Ego versus spirituality. It's about really it's very dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. So this is why they're not investing into something which is more meaningful. I'm talking about infrastructure. And the collapse is a physical. We saw that bridge collapsing. Where was it? I forgot. Baltimore, right? But collapsing. When you see how it collapsed and how actually the infrastructure is not only, of course, both, like going towards a bridge. Many bridges would collapse, but it's big. The infrastructure is about preventing, having all the infrastructure that could prevent this to happen. But that's emblematic of the whole society. They've gone too far. I'm not talking about having a socialist, communist country and so on, but when it's all about profit and when it only benefits a few, 1%, then you have a problem. You cannot have healthcare industry, which is 18% of your GDP, which is not delivering. In terms of the US is the only country in the world that has the life expectancy going down. And actually, there are many indicators. There's Emmanuel Todd. I don't know if you're familiar with Emmanuel Todd. He's the one that predicted the fall of the USSR. And some indicators were related to demography. And those indicators we had in the USSR before the collapse was actually infant mortality and life expectancy. And we see the same indicators in the US of a collapsing society. It's dangerous. It's dangerous.
Yes, absolutely. Like I say, people who are pursuing a profit-driven mentality, it is unsustainable. Because when you're building a country needs infrastructure, it needs healthcare, or everything is going to implode. It needs an education system. And you could see people in Washington looking around, asking each other, wait, how can we fix this problem? Russia's outproducing us. How are they able to do that without half the population and a fraction of our GDP? How is that even possible? And they're talking about how they can fix this problem. It never occurred to them. It's because your system, it's the way you've set up your system. It's the profit-driven mentality is simply incapable of competing against purpose-driven. This one, Angela, I think you might like this one. A few of my Taiwanese friends simply want to be their own country and see America funding as a good thing. They also know about double standards of America, but still want independence. Where did they get this idea of independence? Where did that idea come from? It came from the US, meddling, interfering in their internal political affairs. The U.S. spends millions upon millions of dollars pumping it into Taiwan, into its media, its education, its political system. Absolutely everything. It's the whole concept of a Republic of China exists solely because the U.S. kept it on life support, protected it with tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers following the Civil War. And that is the only reason why Taiwan is the way it is today. It is an artificial creation of the United States. It's an artificial perpetuation of the United States. And it's also unsustainable. And ultimately ask yourself, what happens to an independent Taiwan that China no longer does business with when Taiwan's largest export partner is the rest of China? And I'll tell you what happens. The same thing that happened to Ukraine. So these friends of yours, tell them to look at Ukraine, because that is their unavoidable future if they continue going down this path cut and paved by U.S. interests, their interests at their expense. And then maybe you can add something to that, but this is the last question.
But they're taking the role of, the big brother. Yeah, I don't know if what, when you have kids, and you have a kid, with a small kid, which is bullying the others because he has his big brother on the back. You've seen that. You've seen those
Yes.
movies, or in real life. Well, it's the same. That's the same that the US does. The US is the big brother, and so those small kids, they become empowered. So it's the same as the Baltic states, which I like to call the Chihuahua states. They behave very differently because they have the US on the back, and they're starting to be arrogant with their neighbors, with Russia. They actually are bullying Russian minorities. The Russian minorities in Baltic states are second-grade citizens. And that's what they do. They come up and they say, "I've got your back." So they went to Ukraine and they say, "Oh, we are bottomless. We are going to give you all the money you want. We got your back." I mean, besides the fact that they hijacked the democracy and so on, they're doing the same with Taiwan. But if you realize, well, in reality, you could go to every single province in the world. You could go to Texas. You go to Texas, and if you are more powerful than the US, you start pouring in money there. And you tell the people in Texas, "I'm going to back you to become independent." Well, they'll be like, "Well, and you start building up this idea, this identity. And that's what they did for Taiwan. And in reality, they're rewriting history, and it takes one generation. You start indoctrinating the kids, but ultimately, I tell the Taiwanese, you eat Chinese food, you speak Chinese, you look at yourself in the mirror, you look at history books, the UN says you are Chinese, your passport says Republic of China, your constitution says you are part of China. I mean, what else do you need? I mean, the ultimate test is look at yourself in the mirror. You're not part of the West. So you can you can deny that, but ultimately it's an artificial construction. Taiwanese, they even want to say that Taiwanese is a language. Taiwanese is not a language. You have different dialects. One of the dialects is Fujian dialect, but Fujian is a Chinese province, on the mainland. So what the F are you talking about? But you see, I used to live in Taiwan 30 years ago, and Taiwanese, all of them, they used to say we are Chinese. The problem is that it takes one generation to change people's minds. Indoctrination, media, NGOs, they brainwash kids and so on. And that's the same with Ukraine. It's a construction. That the identity of Ukraine is a complete construction. It never existed. It was a Bolshevik invention. For political reasons, they say we are going to artificially construct this country, but it was never country. Ukraine was not. So you have this minority, like in Western Ukraine, 20%, which actually hijacked all Ukraine. And those guys, they happen to be, most of them, they were the ones that backed the Nazis. Then they collaborated with the Nazis. They were even worse. They were put, the people in Western Ukraine, they were put in prison, the Bandera, because they were too radicals for the Nazis. That's how bad it is.
and that does happen, and you see that among the US backed proxies. They become more American than the most diehard lobbyists in Washington. It's unbelievable, and it's going on even to this day. And again, Taiwan, Ukraine, same story, same game plan, same playbook. People in Taiwan need to look at Ukraine. That is their future if they don't wake up. Okay, so this question here about Hamas being a willful proxy, or are they just useful idiots? It's a big organization. There's a lot of organizations adjacent to it that are kind of lumped into Hamas. I think it's more complicated than that. There is a segment of Hamas that it definitely came out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Anglo-American creation and has been used and is still to this day used by the Anglo-Americans to advance Western foreign policy all across the Arab and Muslim world. So You have to be very careful about that. There are some people in Hamas who realize what's going on. Countries like Russia and China and also Iran try to influence Hamas. They want to transition Hamas from this proxy being used against their own people and move it more toward a legitimate resistance organization like, say, Hezbollah, which, let's just compare Hamas with Hezbollah. Hezbollah ejected Israel from southern Lebanon. When's the last time Hamas has done anything like that? They attacked Israel on October 7th, and they gave Israel a pretext on a silver platter to bulldoze and flatten Gaza and kill tens of thousands of people. That's all Hamas did. That's all they've been doing. So that's just the fact. They're not doing for Gaza what Hezbollah did for southern Lebanon. Is just the fact. So people.
Yeah. I would just add to this. Well, at the present moment, Hamas is the only force in Gaza which is fighting. It's because which is the only force fighting for freeing the Palestinians. For the Palestinian cause, and they're very brave, and kudos to them. I mean, really, it's very brave. But it's important just to put into perspective to understand. There's, and I would say I would be more nuanced in the sense that it's a fringe. It's a fringe of Hamas, which is controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, and we need to remember that also part of Hamas, they were fighting alongside anti-Assad and pretty much. I mean, they were. I don't know if they fought with ISIS, but those ones were not the good guys. So we need to be a bit more nuanced. So I'm skeptical about the whatever is linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a MI6 creation. So just being a little bit more nuanced. It's important to know the background.
I see people saying Gaza is under siege, Brian. Southern Lebanon was literally occupied by Israel. There were Israeli forces controlling southern Lebanon. So it's even worse when you point that out, because Hezbollah ejected Israel out. They played the long game. They played a smart game, ejecting Israel out of their territory, whereas Hamas had an enclave. There were no Israeli forces in there, and they did everything in their power to create a pretext to allow Israel to justify moving into Gaza. They're not justified to go into Gaza because when you look at all of the facts, you see how it was all set up. But what I'm saying is they were either used or they were in on it, something. They did not think it all through. And again, this is where people's emotions blind them to reason. They hate Israel. They see Hamas superficially fighting Israel. They don't care that they're not doing anything to actually liberate the Palestinian people. They don't care that their attack on October 7th, they had such an emotional high. I remember I saw it. We were covering it. They had such an emotional high watching one or two Israeli tanks get blown up. And then we predicted this. From that point onward, Gaza would be flattened. And that's all that's happened. And people are saying, Hamas hasn't been defeated yet. Who says that Israel actually wants to defeat Hamas? It's been the best thing for this extremist regime in Israel. It gives them a perpetual pretext to brutalize the Palestinian people, to constantly militarize their society. The last thing they want is a rational, reasonable, strategically patient resistance in Palestine. It's the last thing that they want, which is why they spend so much time and effort working with Qatar and ultimately the U.S. to get Hamas in there in the first place. And people can say I'm wrong all day. Show me what Hamas is doing to help Palestine.
So what would you say? What would you call about like the PLO? I mean the one in the government which is actually dealing with Israel. What's his name? Abbas. Would you call him? I mean, because then he's the other extreme, like he's a collaborator. I don't know. It's a bit complex. It's a complex issue. You see, the problem is that, to be honest, it's like I do understand. I mean, I do understand Hamas in some ways. I mean, just when you look at the living conditions I mean,
that's what Israel depends on. They go out of their way to bulldoze an old guy under his house, which now is rubble, and kill his children and his grandchildren. They do that on purpose because they know it's going to trigger this wave, this cycle of violence that they can just ride, and they've been riding it for years and years, and there's no end to it. And the only place where you see an end to what Israel is doing is, say, where Hezbollah or Iranian-backed forces in Syria or Iran itself, that's or say the mobilization groups that Iran backs in Iraq, that's where you see it end, because that's where the legitimate resistance begins. And that's what Palestine needs. It's hard for that to take place. I mean, we know that empire is going to try to co-opt legitimate opposition and neutralize it. And that is exactly what they've done. It's not anyone's fault. You're in this confined space surrounded by your enemy. You have no resources, and you're depending on money coming in from Qatar, working with the US, ultimately working with Israel as well. I mean, what do you expect? I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying that that's the reality. People want to cling to this fantasy that Hamas are the heroes just because they see them fighting Israel.
Just the link to Qatar, that's the problem. The link to Qatar. I mean, Qatar has been behind all those terrorist organizations. You know, I don't know. It's a complex relationship. Because you still have the leadership of Hamas in Qatar, but Qatar, you know, when you look at the cooperation, how they work hands in hand with the US, and they've been funding. They've been one of the main sources of the funding of terrorism. It's a complex issue.
Al Qaeda and ISIS, essentially, and they were in on the Saudi invasion of Yemen. Here's somebody here. You know, this is what we're talking about. Brian refuses to discuss Zionism. You know why I don't obsess over Zionism or even Nazism in Ukraine? Because these are all things that the US is using in each one of these countries to co-opt and control people. People imagine that Zionism is at the heart of like the global empire. They control everything, and it's nonsense. It's just like it's nonsense that the Nazis actually control anything. They don't control anything. They've been enabled by the US to do it. They could never have done it on their own. Just like the militant groups in Myanmar would all be wiped out. The Thai opposition here would never have gotten as big as it did without constant US support. So this is what we're talking about, ideology. The US picks an ideology, an appropriate ideology that is divisive in every single targeted nation, and it funds it, it grows it in ways it could never grow on its own, and they get people to mindlessly obsess over that, and they miss the big picture, which is the US is doing this. It's divide and conquer, imperial divide and conquer in the modern age.
I would add to this, Brian, and I think we had this discussion. I will not give names here, but we need pro-Palestinians need to be extremely careful of the fake pro-Palestinians that are extremely anti-Semites. I mean, those guys are actually might be
they might even be in on it. Yes,
it might be actually tools. People, they don't realize that those ones, because ultimately, if you're pro-Palestinians, you should never be anti-Semite. This is absurd. This is so stupid. In reality, very often you might have actually pro-US that actually are there, and to stir up this whole idea of the Jews control the world, and this whole idea of this is just stupid, and people fall in the trap. That's how they do it. They're actually propping up the most radicals, so they make look the pro-Palestinians to be anti-Semite, which most of them are not.
Yeah, and I don't monetize my channel, so I don't care about the algorithm. So no, I'm not avoiding Zionism for the algorithm. I'm avoiding it. I'm not avoiding it. I'm just, it's not important. Okay, yes, there are Zionists in Israel that want to take over everything all throughout the Middle East, just like the Nazis in Ukraine want to defeat Russia and march on Moscow. It will never happen, but they have created these groups of people with these insane ideologies that drive them in the most insane ways, motivating people, sucking people in, motivating them to kill each other. That's what it is. It is a tool. It is not the source of the problem. It is a symptom of the problem.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. But I think
okay. One more, Angelo. What is AIPAC, Brian? Israel's the only country that has a political lobbying group in Washington. This is such nonsense. Ukraine has one. Taiwan has one. Everyone who the Tibetan separatists have one. The militants in Myanmar, the Thai opposition hires lobbyists to go to Washington, even though everything they do is funded and directed by the U.S. because this is how U.S. proxies interact with the United States in Washington. And we see that, I had high hopes that this conflict in Ukraine would wake a lot of people up who believe Israel controls the United States. They would see Ukraine, they would see Zelensky brought in to order everyone in Congress around. They would realize Zelensky isn't actually ordering them around. The people who control him are using him to guilt trip everyone in Congress to go along with the agenda, which is exactly what they use Israel for. And imagine if Ukraine was able to hang in there for a couple of decades like Israel has, how much worse the Ukrainian lobby would be in Washington and how everybody would be bent out of shape to support Ukraine. Just look at all the flags. You see Israeli flags all over the United States the same way you saw Ukrainian flags in 2022. I haven't ever seen it. So people need to wake up. They create these narratives specifically to suck you in, distract you from what is going on. We're warning you about this, and you're just jumping into the frying pan head first. I don't know what to do about it. We'll keep trying, Angelo. We'll keep trying.
No, it's interesting. When you look at, I just realized that when I look at the behavior of Benjamin Netanyahu, he wants to appear, when it comes to the Congress, he wants to appear that he's actually the one in charge. He's actually ordering the congressmen to back Israel, and because it's existential. And the same as Zelensky. Zelensky is so arrogant when he's asking for money. He's extremely arrogant. They want you to believe that they are Ukrainians and Zionists control the U.S. empire. It's not. It's absolutely not. It's the opposite. Actually, Israelis are being used. Ukrainians the same, and the long-term plan that they want to do with Ukraine, and you've seen some articles about this, but they want to create a very similar entity like Israel. But in order to create that, the only way you can create that is that you need to indoctrinate people. And what Ukraine has in common with Israel is that this sense of you create this identity of supremacist identity. And that's Zionism. Zionism is about, you create this artificial thing that we are superior, we have a mission, and so on. And that is going to create this anti-Semitism. It's part of the game. You create that. And that's the same. What did they use in Ukraine? Nazi ideology. It's a supremacist ideology. Why? Because if you create that, those people are willing to die. You need to create an ideology very strong. And so there are many ways. One is sense of supremacy, or you can create ideology and so on. Why, you need to create a sense of why, this existential idea to indoctrinate people. And that's how they use in Ukraine and in Israel. And or there are other proxies like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They indoctrinate those people, the same as ETIM in Xinjiang in China. You indoctrinate people, so they are going to fight your wars.
Yes, by the way, there's a big Xinjiang East Turkestan lobby in Washington. Maybe they're pulling all the levers, and Israel is just a pawn. I think this is a good question, but I already answered it, and because people are so blinded by their emotions, they're not hearing it. What should a legitimate Palestinian resistance be like? Like Hezbollah. That is a legitimate resistance organization and an effective resistance organization, unlike Hamas, which is completely ineffective. It does the exact opposite of protecting the Palestinian people. It rolls out the red carpet for Israeli forces to come, and I don't want to see Gaza flattened. And I'm not going to just cheer on this group because they're the only group that is there if they're not doing a good job defending the Palestinian people. Why would you support them? And the only reason that I can think of that people would support them is because they're so emotionally outraged by what Israel's doing, which I understand, that they don't know what else to do. They're beside themselves, so they support this group that have guns that are pointing them at Israel. But again, remember in 2001, after the September 11th attacks, Al-Qaeda people were saying, well, look at what the US is doing around the world. What do you expect? It's kind of the same mentality. At that point, there were some people that were out there saying, well, maybe Al-Qaeda is justified in doing. They didn't understand what Al-Qaeda actually was. And it didn't become incredibly obvious until Iraq 2003, the US was using Al-Qaeda to bust up the legitimate resistance. There were Shia and Sunni Muslims fighting shoulder to shoulder in Iraq against the American occupation, and the US used Al-Qaeda to trigger a sectarian civil war, which took all the heat off the Americans and got all the Iraqis murdering each other and allowed the US to just sit there, still there to this very day. So history repeating itself. And I couldn't blame people for not supporting a group fighting against injustice. But again, you have to be smarter. You really have to look into this a little bit deeper. And again, look, if you think the U.S. is run by, if you think the U.S. is run by Israel, please just go find another channel. I'm not ever going to agree with it. I'm always going to argue it. Explain to me how Israel, with a tiny GDP and tiny military, completely dependent on perpetual supplies of ammunition and arms from the U.S., what leverage do they actually have over the U.S. that, say, Raytheon, Lockheed, and Boeing don't have? Just explain that to me, because it doesn't make any sense. It's just one of these like lizard people under the planet crust that are running everything. It just doesn't make any sense.
People do some homework. This Zionist project was very clear. At the beginning, actually, they wanted to create you're probably familiar to that, but they wanted to create a foreign entity. It was actually the British Empire. In 1907, there was this conference by the British Empire, and they wanted to create a foreign entity. And what happens is that they actually worked together with the Zionists. There was a Zionist movement, and the Zionists offered their service to work together with those globalist elites already back then. And that's how actually they created this entity. But ultimately, it was not about Israel. It was about, they called it the foreign entity, to actually divide the Arab world in two parts, in between the Levant and the Maghreb, because it was very dangerous to have this huge entity Arab, unified under a language and a similar and so religion, but also because they discover it was extremely rich in oil and gas. And if you look at, 75 years, it was very successful. Just think about this, not only that, we need to go back to, the Ottoman Empire. They managed to turn the Arabs against the Ottoman because they told them, we are going to give you independence. And then they were fooled. Arabs have been fooled all along. I'm sorry, my Arab brothers, but they've been fooled all along. They turned the Arabs against the Ottoman, and then they started, when the Arabs started to have, they designed the borders in order to divide them, and then they made sure they fought each other. Come on. And I see those divisions still now. They haven't regained their own independence. They still, have this sectarian mind. And they're doing right now. It's very sad. On Twitter, I see like pissing contest on saying, well, Iran is a US proxy. I'm like, oh my God, what are you doing?
I don't know. Hold on. There's one comment here that I wanted to.
I see, Brian. I see.
Oh well, it was one about AIPAC is funding both parties. So is Boeing. So is Lockheed. So is Northrop Grumman. Yeah. So is Big Pharma. So is Big Oil. So are the big banks. And guess who has more money than AIPAC? All of these groups, and they don't have to just do it through political action committees. They have all different ways to channel money into the pockets of everyone in Washington, and they have home field advantage over Israel. And so this is just utter madness by people who just simply don't understand how the world works, don't care how the world works. They've developed this because this is what I see a lot of people do, and it's not analysis. They're too lazy to study how the world actually works. And I understand there's a lot to take in. You have to understand economics, industry, all matters, military, history, like you've been saying, Angelo. There's a lot to take in. It's much easier to just blame. There's one evil group that's doing it all. And if we could just get rid of this one evil group that just because this is, again, madness. You see the US doing the exact same thing here in Asia. There's no Jews here in Asia. And what are Jews doing in why are they involved here in Asia? It doesn't make any sense. It makes much more sense that it's just Anglo-American imperialism, because that is what it is, and that's what all the facts point to. I show you the Brookings Institution. Yes, of course, there's going to be corporations that have Jewish people involved, but if you actually do just add it all up, it's not even the majority of them. So wake up, please wake up. And again, if you can't accept that, there's plenty of channels out there that would just love for you to be in their audience and spend your time with them, and I'd gladly lend you over to them on a permanent basis, because I don't know what else to say. And I don't want people like this in my audience, because it's counterproductive to what we're trying to do. We're not lazy. We're not trying to blame everything on some one evil group. Human beings are good and bad everywhere, across all groups. It isn't just Jews. This is ridiculous. And this is the kind of thing that alternative media dips into because it's popular and it gets them lots of followers, and because it appeals to people who are lazy and don't want to understand how the world works. But I want nothing to do with it. No, I'm not going to reconsider about whether or not the Jews are running the entire planet. It's just so stupid. Come to Asia, live in Asia for a while, and you will see all the exact same things happening by people who are most definitely not Jewish. Okay, it is human nature is at the very source of all of these problems. So it's just unbelievable that this 2024 maybe move to. I think there's some people disappearing from their houses and their apartments in Western Ukraine. Maybe you can move there and move into their apartments. I don't know.
Yeah, there were rumors actually. They were putting like those news going after the Jews are behind the communists. And actually, they were even saying that the communists in China are run by Jews. I was like, well, just because Karl Marx was Jew, there are so many shortcuts. They just, it is sad. But it's just like people they oversimplify it. They don't do the homework really. And we are not. We mentioned this quite many times. We are not ideology driven. We're very transparent on what we're seeking here. It's about just giving the most, the information that we think it's true. We might be off sometimes. Once in a while, we're off. We're wrong, but we try to do the homework, all the research. It's very simple. What we're aiming at is sovereignty. It's about people. Being able to decide for their own destiny, and ultimately, what it should be bringing peace, because this imperialistic project is about dividing the world and creating chaos, and that's what we're aiming at. But we don't like the ism, the putting people into boxes. I think that's the worst thing. If you think about putting yourself, all those ideology, I am this, I am that. Why should I say I'm Italian? So what? Who gives a shit, right? But what I'm saying is that people are putting themselves into boxes, and that's how it works with ideology. Are you left? Are you right? Are you social, and so on? And guess what? The problem is that people might not even understand. If you say I am communist, you put yourself into a box. An average Joe, for example, in the US, might not understand what communist means. If you were to say, "Oh, I'm for shared prosperity," it would be more appealing. You see, but ultimately it's the same as communist, But the problem is that people need to be extremely careful. And this is why when I look at China, in reality, they try to be really mindful about this, not focusing too much on ideology. And actually, they rephrase that. So now in China, they don't use much those terms like socialism, communism, and so on, because most average Joe doesn't do the homework on understanding what is behind this. What China is doing is really they said it clearly at the opening of China. They said, it doesn't matter if the cat is white or black, as long as it catches the mouse. And you mentioned once something very similar, metaphor very similar, was that about a tool, right? You need to build a house, and if you use only one tool, a hammer, you're not going to be able to build a house, right? How did you use your metaphor, Brian? It's the same with ideology. You know what? You need to achieve a purpose, and you are going to use many different tools. The more tools you have at your disposal, the more you are going to be able to build your house. Ideology is the same. If you're stuck into one ideology, it's limiting. It's a limiting belief. The more you are flexible with your beliefs, the more you're empowering yourself. That's the same with the actually psychology. Psychology, if you're stuck into one set of ideology, then if you are out, you don't achieve that ideology, then you become unhappy. If you are flexible and you say, well, I'm going to be flexible, then everything becomes possible, because it's limiting your happiness and your development.
Yeah, so it's good to stir the pot every once in a while. Just clear these people out of the chat. I mean, I honestly I don't care. And like I said, this is people have to understand that maybe you're sitting comfortable someplace in the world where none of this is affecting you, and you have the luxury of indulging in these fantasies and not having to figure out what is actually going on. But there are real people doing real damage, killing real people right now as we speak. And the goal here is to educate people what is really happening, what are the forces really involved, and to just wave your hands and say it's just one group and they're doing all of it, and everyone else is just the victim of this one group, and Jews, Jews or any other group. If you look at Washington and the forces there, it's all kinds of people, but they're concentrated. It's a concentration of wealth and power that these people have, and they have all different backgrounds. And we've talked about all the actual different lobbies from all over where the U.S. has these proxies, and they're all mixed in. It's not just one group. And to try to childishly reduce it to that, it's counterproductive, and it's just going to get in the way of waking people up and educating them. I don't know what else to say about that. It's just very disappointing. I don't know if it's just a bunch of trolls that walked in because we were talking about Iran, and like anytime you talk about the Middle East, you'll have those kind of people like a magnet come in, or maybe it really is just that bad. The deep ignorance that the general public has of all of this, maybe it is just kind of hopeless. I don't know, Angela. Like I said, we'll keep trying. We're almost at the 2-hour mark here.
Yeah, it's nice. I just
come
want to
back
say
soon and try to
we have 4,500 people. I'm really glad. Again, we're glad to catch up. Actually, I'm glad to catch up with you, Brian. But it's nice to see we have 4,500 people, and I think it's. I have hope, actually. I just hope that we can contribute somehow. Anyone can actually start its own podcasts. Just learning, if and get the word out there. And there's many people like us that are emerging every single day. I see very interesting people in alternative media, and that's actually the future. So I would say this could be a topic for another episode, but really how people can contribute. I think there are frustration. People are seeing babies being killed in Gaza, and
sure,
injustice around the world, and there are ways to contribute. And I think the way we do, you and I, is somehow it's a kind of therapy, because somehow you need to. I think somehow you need to do something. What do? You see injustice in the world. I take the example of Gaza. Well, you take up the street, you start writing blog, and that's how you start, and somehow that's how we can actually fight the system, because the system controls us, because they use ignorance. They want us to be numb. They want, and they're feeding us with crap. I mean, Netflix, they need us to oversimplify the reality of our own life. It's not only about geopolitics, it's about our own lives too, because that trickles down to our own lives, because that system is going to be a control at the individual level. And we need to fight that trend, and we need to empower people, and knowledge is power. And I think somehow we're not academics, there probably lots of much smarter people out there, but somehow I think, that's a start. And if people can be inspired by that and go out and starting their own podcast and sharing with people, we empower ourselves like this. And that's how you and I, we find meanings, and that's why we are Sunday night, we're taking time out of our family time.
Yes.
They're all asleep, but I think if I think we all have our missions, and I think we all have to try to contribute.
Yeah. One last thing I just want to point out. Do you remember during the War on Terror how there was a growing group of people, and they're still out there, who thought the Muslims were taking over the world and taking over the United States, and there would be news stories like in Fox News about some Qatari sheikh, he's buying a port in Oakland or something. Do you remember that? And now it's shifted from Muslims to now China is buying all of America's farmland. Their elite commandos are sneaking over the Mexican border by the thousands, and it's just a continuation of this same theme where people were blaming everything on the Jews. That one had been going on for generations. And then during the War on Terror, it was Muslims. And then during the Cold War, it was just communists in general, all kinds of communists, Russian, Soviet communists, Chinese communists, Vietnamese, North Korean communists. Now we're back to China. Of course, the Russians are always hiding under everybody's bed. So these are narratives that they use to control people, breed ignorance rather than understanding. This is why I get so upset about it. And Angelo, you live in China, and I live in a country which still does this to a great extent. Russia does this, and they go out of their way to tell their population not to draw lines along race, along religion, along ethnicity, because that is toxic. That is what divides a country. That is what makes a country weak. And no one does that more than the West, and we watch the West circling the toilet right now. So people who are falling into this, they need to wake up and look at what they're a part of and whether they're on the right side or not. And ask yourself, why does Russia or China or the rest of the multipolar world encourage unity and harmony amongst all people, including Jews and Muslims and Christians and all kinds of other groups, ethnicities and races? Why are they on the rise? And why is the West that encourages division, why are they collapsed? Why are they in a state of decline? Just give that some thought.
I find it interesting. You see this whole idea of inclusivity. It is very counterintuitive what I'm going to say, but in the West we cultivate this inclusivity, but in reality what it is, you see, living in Asia, people do not care. We don't talk about races in Asia. I mean, really, we don't. But the problem is that because of this obsession in the West of talking about identity, inclusivity, you do create resentment, because if you put in the face of people, oh, I am sexually, I'm attracted to this, I do this and that, or I'm a woman, or I'm a man, or call me she, call me whatever. People don't care. I mean, really, it's about being pragmatic. You live in Asia. When I see the whole culture here, it's about why do you have to focus on that? That's not important. That's something which is dividing. It's not, by definition. When you start focusing on that, you are creating the divisions, actually, because it was not a problem in the first place. You see, yeah. It's the same as like LGBT in Thailand. I know well Thai. It's a non-issue. Who cares? People do
Nobody
not
cares.
care.
Yeah, they don't care.
In the West, they're putting this, and you imposing ideologies upon people, which they were by already originally, people are, I think there's an extremely high tolerance in general everywhere, people. So and I think that's a strategy of dividing people, but it's very counterintuitive. It's creating divisions more than actually creating inclusivity.
Absolutely. And this is what we have to keep in mind, and this is what we will continue to promote. I was woken up to it, leaving the United States and looking at the U.S. from the outside in, and learning from Thai people who are live and let live, and they don't have all these hang-ups on all these differences. And from the outside, Westerners look at Asia and they just say, "Oh, look, China's all Han Chinese, so of course they don't have these problems." This is there's like 5 different languages on Chinese money, because they have so many different languages, ethnic groups, and religions all living together. So that is a myth, and I understand that Westerners don't know that much about the rest of the world, and that is because of the system doing that to their people. But when you move here and you live here and you learn about that, you start waking up to a much wider world than you could have understood in living in the West, from cradle to grave, being indoctrinated, misled, and manipulated. So I learned a lot about it, and there's a lot that we learn this, and we try to teach other people about this. So we'll just keep doing it. We'll keep at it. We'll keep an eye on this situation in the Middle East. Obviously, we have to keep an eye on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And of course, all of this is leading up to a conflict the U.S. is trying to provoke here in Asia. And these are the 3 main things that we have to pay attention to, which is why I'd rather talk about this than how there might be a Jew hiding in my bathroom when I'm done here. I have to watch out.
Or Russian or Chinese.
Or Russian or Chinese, or maybe a Muslim is trying to buy the house next door to me. I don't know. It's ridiculous. But thank you, Angela, for joining me. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us. And maybe we'll do this again real soon. Haven't done it for like 4 months. Maybe we'll do it again soon. Bye for now.